What if I told you that two nuclear-armed nations, two countries with some of the most devastating weapons ever built by human hands, once sent their soldiers to fight each other with rocks? Not because they ran out of ammunition, not because their weapons malfunctioned, but because they had made a promise to each other. And on a single night in June 2020, that promise turned into the bloodiest hand-to-hand battle fought anywhere on Earth in the 21st century. 600 men, a frozen valley at 14,000 feet above sea level. No guns, no grenades, no airstrikes, no night vision, no backup coming in time. Just men, darkness, ice, and iron-studded clubs. This is the story of the Galwan Valley. And this is the story of why India, on paper, should have been destroyed that night, and why it wasn't. Let's start with something that most people outside of India and China don't know about. In 1996, the two countries' neighbors, rivals, nuclear powers made a quiet agreement. A simple, practical, remarkably sane agreement. No firearms within 2 kilometers of the border. That's it. That was the rule. And it sounds strange, doesn't it? These are two of the most militarily powerful nations on the planet. India and China together have enough nuclear warheads to end civilization multiple times over. Both have stealth aircraft, ballistic missiles, satellite systems, aircraft carriers. Both have armies counted in the hundreds of thousands. And they decided to leave the guns at home when their soldiers patrolled one of the most disputed borders on Earth. Why? Because the men who designed that agreement understood something terrifying and simple. The line of actual control. The LAC is not a real border. It is a line that neither India nor China fully agrees on. Depending on who you ask, the line is in a different place. Soldiers from both sides patrol the same territory. They bump into each other. They argue. They push. And in that environment, with rifles in hand, one accidental shot, a nervous finger, a misheard order, a stumble in the dark, could set off a chain reaction that ends with nuclear missiles leaving their silos. So the two countries agreed. Keep the guns back. Patrol the border with your fists if you have to, but keep the guns back. And for 24 years that agreement held. Confrontations happened. Of course they did. Soldiers from both sides met on ridges and river banks and shouted at each other, shoved each other, threw stones at each other, and then went home. Nobody died. The worst outcome of a border incident between India and China between 1996 and 2020 was a bruised shoulder or a black eye. The last time a soldier had died on this border was 1975, 45 years earlier. Both countries had lived with the agreement. It worked. It was imperfect. It was tense. It was sometimes humiliating, but it worked. And then in the spring of 2020, China decided the agreement was no longer convenient. April 2020. The world is in chaos. A pandemic is spreading across every continent. Nations are closing their borders, locking down their cities, counting their dead. Attention is turned inward. Everyone is looking at their hospitals, their economies, their own fragile futures. This is when the convoys began to move. In eastern Ladakh, in the high cold desert that sits at the roof of the world, surveillance cameras and satellite images picked up something that had no innocent explanation. Chinese military vehicles. Trucks, bulldozers, armored personnel carriers rolling toward the border in numbers that made seasoned analysts uneasy. By May, the scale had become impossible to ignore. More than 1,000 soldiers from China's People's Liberation Army were camped in the Galwan Valley, and they weren't camped on their side of the line. They were camped on India's side, 137 meters inside Indian territory. Tents pitched, fires burning, flags flying. The message was unmistakable. China was not testing. China was not probing. China was claiming. But that wasn't the most alarming part. The most alarming part was that China wasn't just pushing at one point. It was pushing everywhere. From Pangong Lake in the south to Depsang in the north, Chinese forces were moving simultaneously across multiple sectors of the LAC. This was not a local commander making an aggressive call. This was coordinated. This was planned at the highest levels. And this was happening while the world was distracted. On May 5, 2020, 250 soldiers from both sides clashed at Pangong Lake, 70 kilometers south of Galwan. Fists and stones, no guns. The agreement still held, technically, but 72 Indian soldiers were injured that day. And across the entire frontier, the picture was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. China had decided it wanted more. And it had decided that spring of 2020, when India was fighting a pandemic, when the world was looking away, was the moment to take it. Armies talk before they fight. Even enemies maintain channels of communication, especially when both sides know that actual war is a catastrophe nobody wants. On June 6, 2020, Corps commanders from India and China met. Senior officers, men with stars on their shoulders and decades of military experience. They sat across a table in the shadow of some of the highest mountains on Earth, and they talked. And at the end of that meeting, they reached an agreement. Both sides would pull back. Structures that had been built in the disputed area would be dismantled. The status quo before April would be restored. Both sides would verify the withdrawal. Both sides would go home. It sounded like reason prevailing. It sounded like two nuclear powers stepping back from the edge. China began dismantling its camp at Patrol Point 14 in the Galwan Valley. The tents came down. The structures came apart. Indian observers confirmed it. The process was working. 8 days passed, and then the tents came back. Not the same tents, not a casual return. The camp was rebuilt. An observation post was erected on the Indian side of the line. And this time, the soldiers who returned with the tents and the structures brought something else. Iron rods, clubs wrapped in barbed wire, batons studded with iron nails, riot shields, body armor, helmets. These were not weapons someone grabbed in anger. These were not improvised. They were manufactured. They were brought from somewhere, from factories, from warehouses, and they were brought deliberately to this specific valley on this specific ridge at this specific altitude. These weapons were made for a purpose. And later, weeks and months later, after the dust had settled and intelligence agencies from 3 different countries had been piecing together what happened, the picture became horrifyingly clear. American intelligence confirmed that the entire operation in the Galwan Valley had been personally authorized by General Shi, the commanding officer of China's Western Theater Command. This was not a regional decision. This was not a mid-level commander acting on initiative. The highest levels of China's military chain of command had personally approved what happened next. The June 6th agreement, the handshake, the pullback, the verification process was never a peace deal. It was bait. The plan was elegant in a cold, brutal way. Agree to withdraw. Wait for India to send soldiers to verify the withdrawal. And when those soldiers arrive, unarmed, because that is the protocol, because that is the agreement. Meet them with 300 men in full riot gear carrying medieval weapons. Ambush them, overwhelm them, humiliate them, force them to retreat. Make it a message that every soldier on every ridge of the LAC would understand. China had been planning this for weeks, possibly months. India had no idea. On the night of June 14, 2020, Colonel Santosh Babu, commanding officer of the 16th Bihar Regiment, sat down with his phone and made a video call. His wife answered. Their children were there. He spoke calmly. He told her he would be busy for the next couple of days. He told her to be strong. That was the last time she spoke to him. Colonel Santosh Babu was 37 years old. He was the only son of his parents. He had been in command of the 16th Bihar Regiment for 6 months. He was the kind of officer his men spoke about with a particular kind of respect. Not the stiff, formal respect that rank demands, but the warmer, deeper respect that a man earns. The next afternoon, June 15th, 2020, Colonel Babu assembled 75 of his soldiers and began walking toward Patrol Point 14. 75 men. The mission was simple. Confirm that China had removed the structures it had agreed to remove under the June 6th agreement. Look at the camp, verify the dismantlement, file the report, walk back. A verification patrol. Standard procedure. No drama anticipated. They carried no weapons. Why would they? The protocol was clear. Verification patrols are unarmed. The 1996 agreement was in place. This was supposed to be paperwork with boots. Colonel Babu arrived at Patrol Point 14 and found the camp exactly as it had been before the supposed withdrawal. Tents, structures, an observation post. Nothing had been removed, nothing had been dismantled. He confronted his Chinese counterpart, asked him why the agreement had not been honored. The response was not an explanation. A Chinese soldier shoved him. A fist fight broke out, the kind of confrontation that had happened dozens of times on this border over the past 20 years. Shoves, punches, it flared and then it paused, both sides catching their breath. And then Colonel Babu heard something. Above the roar of the Galwan River, that constant, crashing, glacial sound that never stops in that valley. He heard something else. Footsteps, not footsteps. Something larger than footsteps. A rumbling, a drumming, a thunder that came from deeper in the valley, from the darkness where no moonlight reached. The sound of boots, hundreds of them, hitting frozen ground. Hard, fast, getting louder. Not walking, not marching, sprinting. 300 men came out of the dark. Full riot gear, body armor, helmets, iron rods, nail-studded clubs, barbed wire batons, shields. 75 Indians had come for a conversation. They were now facing an army. Let me try to make you feel for just a moment what these men were standing in. 14,000 feet above sea level. That is roughly 2.5 miles straight up from where you are sitting right now. At that altitude, the air is thin, genuinely, physically thin. Every breath delivers roughly half the oxygen that a breath at sea level delivers. Your muscles work harder and receive less fuel. Your heart races to compensate. Your thinking slows. Simple physical tasks, climbing a slope, lifting a heavy object, become exhausting in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Now add this. It was nighttime. There was no moon. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The ridge where this battle was fought is narrow. A few men could stand abreast. On one side, steep rock climbing to higher ground. On the other side, a sheer drop down to the Galwan River below. A river of glacial melt, barely above freezing, fast and brutal. The locals who live downstream call the Shock, the river that the Galwan flows into, by a name that translates roughly as River of Death. This was the battlefield. For 6 hours, 600 men fought on that ridge. The Chinese had the advantage of preparation. They had arrived first. They had taken the high ground before the fight began. From above, they rained stones down on the Indian soldiers below. They rolled boulders off the ridge onto men who couldn't see where the attack was coming from. They had dammed small streams earlier in the day, and at strategic moments during the battle, they released the water, sending walls of near-freezing water rushing across the Indian positions in the dark. This was not a street fight that got out of hand. This was a prepared military operation. The terrain had been studied and modified in advance. The timing was deliberate. The weapons were manufactured for this purpose. Every advantage was on China's side, and Colonel Santosh Babu stood at the front of his men and fought. He was not behind them. He was not issuing orders from a safe distance. He was at the front, in the middle of it, with no weapon except his hands and whatever he could grab. A heavy stone struck his head. He bled. He kept fighting. He kept shouting orders to his men through the chaos and the cold and his own pain. And then he fell. The ridge was narrow. The footing was treacherous. The darkness was absolute. Colonel Santosh Babu, commanding officer, 37 years old, only son, husband, father, went over the edge and into the Galwan River below. He was the first Indian officer killed in action against the People's Liberation Army in 53 years. The men who survived that night, the ones who came home, the ones who could speak about it later, all said something similar when they tried to describe what the battle was like. They said they could only know what was happening within arm's reach. The valley amplified sound in strange ways. The cracking of iron clubs against bone echoed off the rock walls. The screaming from men who had been hit, who had fallen, who were sliding toward the river's edge. All of it bounced and multiplied in the narrow gorge until it became a wall of sound that told you nothing useful. You couldn't see who was beside you. You couldn't tell who you were fighting. You could not know if the man next to you was your brother or your enemy. You could only feel the cold on your skin, hear the river beneath you, and keep swinging. Men fell into the Galwan all through that night. Some were pushed, some lost their footing on the ice-slicked rock, some were thrown. The Galwan River at that altitude in June is glacial melt. It is not merely cold. It is the kind of cold that takes control of your muscles within seconds of contact, that makes your limbs stop obeying you, that turns your body against you. Men who fell in injured could not climb out. The current took some. Others managed to drag themselves onto the rocks along the bank, and they lay there bleeding, unable to move, unable to call for help above the roar of the water. Of the 20 Indian soldiers who lost their lives that night in the Galwan Valley, only 8 died from the direct violence of the battle. 12 of them died from the cold. They lay on the rocks by the river, wounded and alone, and they waited. They waited for dawn. They waited for help. They waited for someone to find them. Some of them waited too long. 12 men who survived the iron clubs, who survived being thrown from the ridge, who survived the freezing water. 12 men who had done everything right, died because the cold of the Himalayas does not care how brave you are. Let that sit with you for a moment. 12 men, frozen, alone, in the dark. In the Galwan Valley clash at Patrol Point 14, Indian troops received confirmation that their commanding officer, Colonel B. Santosh Babu, had been killed during an ambush. Despite being outnumbered and operating at high altitude in darkness, Indian reinforcements, including Ghatak commandos and units from the Punjab and medium regiments, advanced toward the conflict instead of withdrawing. Adhering to existing protocols, the soldiers were initially unarmed. During the confrontation, they seized improvised weapons used by Chinese troops, such as iron rods and spiked clubs, and engaged in close combat. The arrival of reinforcements shifted the situation. Despite numerical and positional advantages, Chinese forces eventually retreated. Indian troops pursued them up to and across the line of actual control. The ambush, intended to overwhelm Indian forces, did not achieve its objective. While the Ghatak commandos were chasing the PLA back across the LAC, while the valley was still filled with the sounds of men who had survived and men who hadn't, one figure moved through the darkness, doing something different. Nike Deepak Singh was 30 years old, a nursing assistant with the 16th Bihar Regiment. He had been married for 15 months. His wife's name was Rhea Singh. He wore a jacket with a Red Cross symbol on it, the universal mark of a medical worker, the mark that says, "I am not here to fight, I am here to heal." His white medical kit was open on the rocks: bandages, antiseptic, gauze, the tools of a man who came to save lives. And he had been saving lives. All through that night, in the chaos and the dark, Deepak Singh had been moving through the battle, treating Indian soldiers. More than 30 of his fellow soldiers were alive that night because of what his hands had done. Then he found 6 Chinese soldiers. They were lying on the rocks, wounded and abandoned. Their comrades had retreated, leaving 6 injured men behind, 2 officers and 4 soldiers. Alone and wounded, they waited as Deepak Singh knelt and began treating them. A rock came from somewhere in the darkness behind him. It struck him above his right eye. Blood ran down his face and into his eyes. An Indian officer, watching what was happening, shouted toward the Chinese, "You are attacking a medic who is treating your own soldiers." Deepak Singh wiped the blood from his face. He finished bandaging the Chinese soldier in front of him, a man whose face was covered in blood from a head wound. And he said the words that I believe will be remembered long after most of what happened that night has been forgotten. He said, "I am fine." 2 words. I am fine. A rock had just opened a wound above his eye. He was at 14,000 feet, in freezing temperatures, in the dark, in the middle of a battle where his commanding officer had just died, treating soldiers who had come to kill his brothers. And he said, "I am fine." And he kept working. The Chinese captured him. They used him. He was a skilled medical worker, and they needed medical workers. So they used him to treat more of their wounded soldiers. And then they killed him. The Indian Army awarded him the Veer Chakra, one of India's highest wartime honors, posthumously. India announced its casualties within days: 20 soldiers, 20 names, 20 hometowns. 20 families who would receive folded flags and medals, and official delegations, and the terrible permanent weight of a loss that no word or ceremony can adequately address. India told its people. India owed its people that truth, and India gave it. China said nothing. 1 week passed, nothing. 1 month passed, nothing. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, silence. 8 months after the battle in the Galwan Valley, 8 months during which Chinese state media had published not a single name, not a single confirmed casualty figure, China announced its official toll. Four. 4 soldiers killed. The country that had come to the valley with 300 men in body armor, carrying manufactured weapons, that had planned this operation at the highest levels of its military command, that had built an elaborate ambush against a verification patrol of 75 unarmed men. That country claimed it had lost 4 soldiers. American intelligence agencies, analyzing satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and human intelligence, put the Chinese casualty figure at 35. Russian assessments from a country that has no particular reason to favor India in this dispute said the number was closer to 45. An Australian investigative journalism team spent months piecing together what had happened in the valley that night and concluded that at least 38 PLA soldiers had drowned in the Galwan River alone. Not killed in the fighting, drowned. Panicking in retreat, swept downstream in the freezing darkness, taken by the same river that had taken Colonel Babu. And the commander of India's Northern Command, watching from across the valley in the hours after the battle, counted 60 stretchers being carried away on the Chinese side. 60. On the same day, China officially acknowledged 4. Now, I am not a military analyst. I cannot tell you with certainty which of these numbers is closest to the truth. But I can tell you that when a country passes a law, on the very same day it announces its casualty figures, making it a criminal offense for any citizen to question those figures, it is not behaving like a country that is confident in its own accounting. You might wonder why Galwan Valley matters now, years after the battle. The dead were buried. Diplomats have met. Trade continues. Here's why. It revealed China's strategic playbook, that agreements are tactical tools, that verification can be bait, that you move when your opponent is distracted. It revealed the limits of material advantage. 300 armed men could not break 75 unarmed ones who refused to break. It revealed something about India's military that India itself sometimes underestimates. The 16th Bihar Regiment, the 3rd Punjab Regiment, these are not elite special forces. These are regular soldiers patrolling in the cold every day, doing unglamorous work. When the moment came, they did not flinch, and it revealed the cost of silence versus truth. India told its people what happened. 20 names, 20 hometowns, 20 families allowed to grieve publicly because the dead deserved that. China told its people 4 names and passed a law to stop anyone from asking about the rest. I know which country I respect more for that. I think most people do too. If this series is the kind of history you want more of, told straight with the details that actually matter, consider subscribing.